Now it's time to use our sprites to create objects. Okay, so we have our sprites. The next thing we need are objects. I'm going to go ahead and collapse this sprites menu, and I'm going to right-click on objects and create an object. Again, we need to make sure that our objects are well named. However, objects are named a little differently than sprites. We have a sprite called player. We can't also have an object called player. Two different assets cannot have the same name. Objects will always be named with OBJ underscore in the front. This is a common naming convention and one that I will hold you to. So we're going to call this first object OBJ underscore player. And we're going to, here where it says no sprite, we're going to click and choose our player sprite. Again, yours probably doesn't look like mine. I don't really care what they look like because this is just going to be a placeholder. It should be 32 by 32. So right now, our object has an image, but it doesn't really do anything. So we could put our player in the room, but we have no way of moving it around or doing anything with it. So we're going to add an event. Right here, we're going to click Add Event. And the event we're looking for is key pressed left. So Add Event, key pressed left. When your event opens up, it will have two starting comments. Comments always turn green and are always preceded by either 3 forward slashes, 2 forward slashes, or there is a third type of comment that is preceded by a forward slash and a star, and later ends in a star and a forward slash. This type of comment is used when your comment is going to run over multiple lines. We probably won't be using that. But I will expect you to use the 3 comments for our description. That should always be the very first line of every event that you code. So you have to have the 3 forward slashes. You have to have that space. It has to say at description. And then we're going to remove this, insert description here, and write our own description. So this should move left. That's what this method should be doing. We're going to use this left, key press left, to make our player move to the left. Now, this is a different kind of comment. 2 forward slashes on a comment line are used throughout your code. 3 forward slashes are only the first line of the event code, and you'll notice that what I typed here, move left, shows up over here in our events window. The point of the description comment is so you don't actually have to open this event window to see what this does. So we're going to end up with a long list of events, and we'll know what each event does by that little short description there. It does need to be a short description. Okay, so then I'm going to have this comment line, and on this comment line, I'm going to write move 5 spaces. Now the code to make our player move 5 spaces, we're going to write x equals x plus 5. Your player's position is determined by an ordered pair xy, very similar to geometry. with a little twist. However, it is similar to geometry in the fact that X will be our first coordinate, and that is our left or right position. That's our horizontal position. Y, the second coordinate, is our vertical position. Y is a little different, so we'll talk about that in a bit. So here I have my move left. That's using key press left. Now left is referring to the left arrow. So when I press the left arrow, my player should move left. We're going to test this. You should always code a little, test a little. So we do one little thing, and then we're going to test it. So we're going to open our room. I don't like this black background on my room, so I'm going to start by changing the color of the background in my room. Rooms are built in layers. We will eventually have multiple layers in here, but you always start out with two. The bottom layer, or the layer that's drawn first, is the background layer. Then above that, you're given an instance layer. We'll talk about that in a minute, but let's look at the background layer. Right now, the color of our background is black. By the way, I know this isn't spelled the way we spell color. However, since Yo-Yo Games is based out of Australia, they use English writing. This is the English version of color. So don't complain to me that things aren't spelled right. They are if you lived in the right country. What I want to do is change the background color of this because black is just going to be too dark for me. So I'm going to click on that to bring up a color picker, and I want to use a brown, but that's too dark. So I'm going to use a lighter tan. I'm going to just kind of play around here and find a light tan. What I want is kind of a sand color. So that's not too bad. I don't know if I like that. Okay, I like that. So I want you just to pick out some kind of a sand color. I'm going to save that in my stored colors. Remember we had those three that we did earlier? And I'm going to say okay. And now it's going to be this sandy color. Okay, so there's my background. We're not going to worry about the size. There's some other things in here we're not going to worry about. The size is listed down there, and we'll just leave it at that size for now. So that's all we're going to do to our background at the moment. Now we want to put objects in our room. When you drag an object into your room, that object creates an instance. You can actually drag multiple instances of the same object into your room, though it would be odd to have multiple player objects. So we're just going to create one player object, but we're going to put it on this instance layer. You cannot put a player on your background layer. And in fact, if you attempt to drag this player object over here, see that little red X, and it's going to tell you this asset can only be applied to an instance layer. All right, so we'll close that. We'll choose our instance layer, and we'll drag our player over here. I'm just going to drop him somewhere in the middle, and then we're going to run our game. Now, we're supposed to go left when we hit the left arrow. Oops, we're going right. And if I hold this left arrow down, it only jumps one time. I would like to be able to hold the left arrow down and go until I let go of it, but I also want to make sure the left arrow sends me left. So we actually have two errors in our code. Let's go back to our workspace. I'm going to make my room editor smaller so I can see a little bit more. So we have two errors. These are called logic errors. They don't prevent the game from running, but they don't produce the right outcome. So we're going to try and look at this and figure out what's wrong. All right, well, the fact that we're moving to the right instead of to the left has to do with this line of code right here. We want to move 5 spaces, but we want to move 5 spaces to the left. I've added 5. Well, that's moving me to the right. So how about we try and subtract 5? So now when I run it, and I use my left arrow, okay, now I'm going in the right direction, but I still have to click, 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 click. Okay, that's not what I want. So I don't really want to just move 5 spaces. I want to simply move to the left. I would like to move to the left as long as the left arrow is pressed. Okay, so I want to move to the left as long as the left arrow is pressed. My code is correct. It's my event that is the problem. So let's look at events. We have down here this key pressed. That's what we used. That didn't work. We have key up. That doesn't seem right either. But we do have key down. Now we could recreate this event and copy and paste our code over. Or instead of doing that, I'm going to right click, key press, and I'm going to change this event. I'm choosing change event, and I'm going to change it to key down left. Now I have key down left. It's supposed to move me left. I want to move to the left as long as the left arrow is pressed. We're going to now test that and see if it works. There's my player. I'm holding my left arrow and it works. And my right arrow, up and down arrows, they don't seem to work, but my left arrow works. Ooh, but my player goes all the way off the screen. Probably not what we want to have happen, but the event itself actually works and is coded properly. Okay, so what we want to do is add right arrow, up arrow, and down arrow. So we're going to, again, look at events. I'm going to add an event. We know it's key down that we want, and we're going to use right. So when I hold the right arrow, I should move right, and I want it to move right as long as the left arrow is held down. All right, so we actually coded this before without understanding it. X equals X plus 5. Now, why are we using 5? Well, 5 is actually determining how quickly we move each step. Remember, we talked last week about frame rate, frames per second. That is also the number of steps we have per second. So each second, we're going to move 60 times in each second. That's why we're moving fairly quickly, even though all we're moving is 5 pixels at a time. So there's my right. Again, I'm going to test that. Holding the right arrow key, left arrow key, got my left and right movement down. I'm happy. Now we need up and down movement. So we'll add another event, another key down event, and we'll use the up arrow. The up arrow should make us move up. And here we want to move up as long as the up arrow is held. So X is left and right movement. Y is up and down movement. We want to go up. That's a positive direction, so I'm going to write Y plus 5. And that should work for us. So we run our game. Always code a little, test a little. Code one little thing, check to make sure it works. Ooh, that's not going the right direction. I'm pressing the up arrow, but I'm going down. Okay. That's curious. Turns out that in programming, in all languages, up is negative and down is positive, the opposite of geometry. That's because the origin in any window is always the top left corner. Way up here in the top left corner, this is 0, 0. Coming down, Y gets positive. Going up, Y gets negative. So to move up, we needed to subtract from Y. I'm going to copy this by selecting it and using Control-C. Click Add Event, key down, down arrow. I'm going to select what's here and paste over it using Control-V, because moving down is very similar to moving up. Make sure that if you're going to copy and paste, that you update. I need to update my comments. And we need to update our code. Moving up is subtracting from Y. Moving down is adding to Y. So now I'm going to run this. And left, right, up, down. Perfect. Okay, so we have several other sprites. I'm going to expand this just to remind us what we have. We have a box, we have a face, we have flowers, grass, we have a heart, we have a stump. I'm just going to use flowers, grass, and the stump right now. So I am going to right-click on objects and create an object called obj underscore flowers. Remember, all object names need to start with obj underscore. We're going to choose our flowers sprite. Then I'm going to create an object called obj underscore stump, and choose my stump sprite. And one more, create object obj underscore grass using the grass sprite. Now, these three objects, they don't move around. They don't really have any functionality, so they're not going to have any events on them. Just because you have an object doesn't mean you have to have an event. Some objects don't really do anything. They just kind of sit there, and that's what these are going to do. So I'm going to go back to my room. And now we could put these background objects on the same layer as our player, but eventually that's going to cause us problems. So we really should keep our room better organized. So first, I'm going to rename this player. And layers tend to start with capital letters. So that's my player layer. I'm going to select my background, and I'm going to create a new instance layer. Now, the reason I selected background first is because when I create a new instance layer, it always creates above whatever layer is currently selected. So I'm going to create a new instance layer. I'm going to rename this, and I rename it by clicking on the name until I can backspace and delete it. It's a little tricky sometimes. We're going to call this background images. Background images. Sure, background images. Now, I want to make sure that background images is what's selected. By the way, if you accidentally created that so that it's above the player, just drag that down below the player. It's important that this be below the player image. That way the player is able to walk over the grass and the flowers. We're going to prevent him from walking over the stump, but he will walk over the grass and the flowers, not behind them. Okay, so we've got our background, we've got our background images, we've got our player. We're going to select the background images layer, and I'm going to collapse sprites so we don't accidentally try and use sprites. By the way, if you did try to drag your flower sprite over here, you're going to get this error message saying that this asset can only be applied to an asset layer. We're not going to use asset layers. We're not going to put sprites in the room. We're only going to put objects in the room. So we're going to just drag some flowers over here. So once you've selected flowers, so you can hold the Alt key, and then you'll be able to click around and place as many flowers as you want to. Now, if you hold the Alt key and drag, you'll get a whole bunch of flowers. So I could build me a little flower garden here. Then I want to place some grass. Again, I'm going to hold the Alt key and just place some grass. I might want some clumps of grass. Place some grass around my room. Just trying to kind of fill up the area a little bit. And then we're going to put in some stumps. So again, I'm using my Alt key, and I'll put in a few stumps. Some stumps above my player, some stumps beside my player, around the room. Just no big deal. You don't want to put too much stuff in the room. It'll get too busy to look at. But I just want to test some things. Okay, so now we have grass and flowers in our room. We have our player. Our player moves left, right, up, and down. We can run the game and see what it looks like. And our player can walk over the grass. He can walk over the flowers, walk over the stumps, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So we're going to prevent him from walking over the stumps. And while we have this open, I want to just show you that our player can actually walk diagonally by holding down two keys at the same time. As long as one is vertical and one is horizontal, we can actually walk diagonally. So we can literally move all over this open world. I'm going to close my game. And we don't want our player to be able to walk over the stumps. So I'm going to shrink this up. I'm going to go back to my player object by clicking on it. If you click on the icon, the picture of your objects, it's a little bit easier to jump to them. So I'm back in my player object. And this time we're going to add event, and we're going to add a collision event. Collision events are triggered when two things collide. Go figure. We want to do something when we collide with the stump. So we're going to create a collision event with stump in our player object. Now the collision event is only placed in one of the two objects. And typically the collision event goes in the object that's doing the moving. So that's why we're putting this in our player and not in our stump. It's the player that's colliding with the stump, not the other way around. So when our player collides with our stump, what I want him to do is just to stop. Okay, so we want our player to stop moving. But in order to make our player stop moving, what we really need to do is move back to our previous location. Okay, so if I run into a stump, I'm going to move back to where I was before I collided with the stump. If you just stop, then you're in a constant collision. I don't want to be in a constant collision. I just want to back up one, and then I'm going to stop. And in order to do that, I'm going to set my x value equal to x previous. Now, x is our location horizontally, y is our location vertically, and then there are these other built-in variables in GameMaker. Notice that the x and x previous are both green. That means they're built-in variables. X previous is just that, the x location that you were just before this event happened. This event is our collision event. So just before we collided with the stump, we're going to move back to x previous. For vertical movement, I'm going to type y equals y previous. But I don't have to type out the whole word because we get these drop-down menus that help us complete our code. This is called auto-completion. I'm just going to choose y equals y previous. That's already highlighted, so I could click on it, or I can just hit enter, and it will automatically populate into my code. By the way, every code statement should end in a semicolon. That's a semicolon, not a colon. So don't forget to end your statements with a semicolon. Now, when I run into a stump, this is going to move me back. So again, code a little, test a little. So we're going to test this. We run our game. We look for a stump. There's a stump above us. Oh, okay. So it stopped me, and I can't move onto it, but I can move back down. How about this one? Oh, there. Look, I don't even have to catch the whole thing. Just the edge of my player caught that stump, and that stopped me. So it's working from the top and the bottom, from the left and the right. So there is my code that will prevent me from walking over stumps. That doesn't have anything to do with walking over flowers or walking over grass. We can still do that. We just can't walk over stumps. And that's what we wanted to have happen. So now we have this issue, though, still, that we're moving all the way off our playing field, which we really don't want to be able to do. And we could do a number of things to prevent that. Sometimes, with some programs, when you walk off the left side, it automatically wraps you around and brings you back onto the right side. That's not really what I want to have happen in this particular game. What I want is to stop. I want it to stop at the edge and not be able to walk off, similar to what we have when we run into the stump. I'm going to close this out, And I'm going to go back here and look at my sprites. Remember, we had this box sprite we have not created an object for. So I'm going to create an object. And I'm going to call this object obj underscore boundary. Even though we're going to use the box sprite, the name of our sprite and the name of our object do not have to match. They won't always. But this is going to be my boundary. So I'm just using my box sprite. The box sprite is pretty small. We're not going to worry about that. I'm calling it obj underscore boundary. Now again, the boundary isn't what's moving. So we're not going to have any events in our boundary objects. However, back in our player object, we do want a collision with boundary. When I collide with my boundary, again, I want to stop. And I want to move back to my previous position. Well, I could code that, but the fact is, I've already coded that in Stump. So I'm just going to copy these 3 lines of code using Control-C, come back here into my boundary collision. I'll get rid of that comment and paste these 3 lines of code because we needed them to do exactly the same thing. Now we have to put our boundary in our room in order for it to work. So I need to go back to my room. Oops, didn't mean to open that room manager. That happened because I double clicked on this house right here. Not really what I wanted. I'm going to double click in the gray area to the side. That'll bring up my room. And I'm going to close this and close this, and I'm going to move my room over a little bit. I'm using my middle mouse button to move my room over. Just with my mouse anywhere in the black area, hold that middle mouse button down and you can pan around and move things in your view. I do want to be able to see the outside edges of my room. Okay, so I don't want it to be so big that it's filling the entire screen. I'm going to drag this boundary object over, and I want it to be right up against my room, but that's not working out for me. So you notice objects always jump in a specific distance. And if you think about it, the size of our object is 32 by 32, and so my object is jumping 32 pixels at a time. I want to stop that. So in order to make it stop, I'm going to turn off the grid. These white grid lines, they're not showing up when we run our game. They're just here for placement. So I can turn off the grid. And if I turn off the grid, now I can actually move objects anywhere in my room. They don't have to jump to that 32 grid square. And now I can select my boundary and scooch it over using the arrow keys until it's right up against our room. Now, if you're not sure that it's close enough, you can always zoom in some and move over and make sure that you are right up against the room. That's fine, but I don't really want to drag over a whole bunch of boundaries for the entire length of this room, and I don't have to. I can just grab a hold of the bottom, and you see that arrow right there? That means you can stretch this, and I'll stretch it down until it's at the bottom of my room. Then I will drag another boundary. With that selected, I'll place it up against my room, and I'll drag it, stretch it by dragging the side of it over until It's the length of, or the width of my room. Okay, now I could drag another boundary here and stretch it, drag another boundary here and stretch it, but I don't really need to. I'm going to bring my room editor back. Move this over. And notice that we're on our background images layer, which is fine. That's a fine place, a good enough place to put our boundaries. We could put our boundaries on their own layer. And in fact, I might want to do that, but I know they were the last two things added, so I know they're at the bottom of my list of objects in my room. These are all the objects that are in your room, all the instances of those objects. And I put a bunch of flowers, and then I put a bunch of grass, and then I put a bunch of stumps. That's why they're grouped. They would not group if I added, say I added another grass right here. It's going to be at the bottom of my list, okay? But I've got these two boundary objects. The objects that's selected is going to be gray. I'm going to copy this. Whatever's selected, I'm going to Control C to copy it. I'm going to Control V to paste it. And then I'm going to move it to the top. I'm going to do the same thing for this object on the side. I'm going to Control C, Control V, and move it to the left. So now I have boundaries all the way around my room. I'm not real crazy about the fact that these boundaries are in this layer with all of my grass and stumps and flowers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another layer. I'm going to put it just above my background instance layer. I'm going to right click and rename it boundaries. If you have a hard time renaming, you can right click. That's always another way to rename. Then I'm going to choose my background images. Now, I don't have to delete these because all I really have to do is drag down here to the bottom. I'm going to select them, holding the Control key and clicking all four of them. And I'm going to Control X to cut, open my boundaries layer, come down here, Control V to paste. So I've moved those from one layer to another without needing to delete them and without needing to replace them. All right, so I've got my background layer. That's just the brown. I've got my boundaries, just those four boundaries. I've got some background images, and I've got my player. And now when I run my game, I should be stopped by each stump, which I am, and I should be stopped by each boundary. Make sure that you test every boundary in your game. You want to make sure that every boundary is working. Now, if your player is running slightly off of your screen, like can't quite see all of them, that's because your boundary isn't exactly up against the edge of your window. So you can fix that in the room, but this is working for us. That's enough for today. Have a great day. Next up, we'll talk about variables.